to the course here. I know that you guys probably had a great break and you're kind of rough around the edges on U.S. history, so I thought perhaps what we ought to do was do just a little bit of brief reintroduction to World War II, because that's kind of what we've been talking about. So if you were given, if you paid attention to the syllabus, you noticed that we started World War II already, and we're going to continue talking about World War II for this first part of the quarter. And then here in a week or two, we will have a quiz or an exam, over World War II to finish us off. So I did, however, want to kind of recap what we've talked about so far. If you remember, there's some pretty significant things going on in Europe at this time. By 1939, 1940, Europe is at war. And if you recall, the European powers had broken up into two separate groups. We have the Axis powers, which are, for all intents and purposes, the bad guys. That would be Germany and Italy and Japan. And then we have the Allied powers, which this time included Britain and France, what was left of France, and Russia. And so when we are attacked at Pearl Harbor, we will go ahead and join up with the Allied powers. Now, if you recall, when we left last semester, what was happening was that Britain had been fighting against the Germans, and they had begun to run out of supplies and run out of money to pay for new supplies. So they had to kind of broker a deal with the United States. And that deal became known as the Lend-Lease Act. And essentially what happened was we would lend, for lack of a better word, Britain goods like weapons and tanks and planes and cars and things like that, ships. And so for that lending of those things, then Britain would lease us military bases. Now, I mentioned this before, but one of those military bases is going to become very, very important later on when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it's going to be that military base in Turkey that's going to become kind of a turning point there. So, but more on that a little bit later. So, we have to do this Lend-Lease Act to keep providing goods to Britain. Now, what we're talking about here is just review, guys. You don't have to write this in your notes. You don't need to you just need to be aware of it. We've already talked about this stuff. So, all right. So as far as that goes, when we're talking about Britain being involved in the war, France being involved in the war, and Russia being involved in the war, if you recall, Germany and Russia had signed an agreement called the Non-Aggression Pact. And Germany had said, we're not going to invade Russia as long as Russia doesn't invade us, and then we'll go ahead and split Poland, right? We're going to both invade Poland, Russia coming in from the east side of Poland, and Germany coming in from the west side of Poland, and they're going to go ahead and invade Poland. And it's at that point, when they invade Poland, that Britain and France will declare war on Germany. Now, of course, Germany's then going to turn the other direction. They're going to go ahead and invade France, and they're going to take over Paris. And so that's kind of where we had left off in Europe last time. Then, of course, after that, Germany would try to invade Britain, and what we call the Battle of Britain. Now, if you recall, the Battle of Britain didn't turn out so great for Germany, because Germany tried to invade Britain, or at least knock Britain out of the war, by dropping a massive amount of bombs on them. And that was a good tactic for a while, because what they had gotten into the habit of doing is they would attack at night. And so the planes would fly in over Britain at night. And of course, as they're flying in, you can't see the planes because it's nighttime, and the planes would simply shut off their lights, and so they couldn't be seen. But what the planes could see was all the major big cities in Britain, like London and other cities like that, because they were lit up at night. They had street lamps, and they had houses with lights and buildings with lights and that kind of stuff. And so these planes would fly in, be able to see these buildings, and they would drop as many bombs as they could before they turned around and flew out. Now, that had a really good advantage for Germany for a while, and in fact, the Battle of Britain was going in Germany's favor. But then the British invented something that helped them out. They invented radar. And so if you recall, radar helped them to spot planes flying in, and so consequently, they could go ahead and fight back against the Germans. And so it's only a matter of weeks before Hitler is ready to give up on the whole idea of invading Britain. Now, when he does that, he's going to go ahead and turn around and start invading Russia. Okay, so at this point now, where we kind of left off at the end of the year, Germany was invading Russia. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. And then America had gotten involved in the war because here at this point then, we've been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so I'll go ahead and insert this here now because that's kind of an appropriate place for it. Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese, and America had declared war on Japan. Now, because Japan and Germany and Italy had joined in what's called the Tripartite Pact, they had what's called a mutual defense treaty. In other words, if one country declared war on any one of the three countries, then the other two countries would also declare war on that country. So we get attacked at Pearl Harbor. We declare war on Japan because Japan is in that pact with Germany and Italy. Then Germany and Italy will declare war on us. Okay, so now we are in a war on two separate fronts, and that's a pretty big deal because that means that if you're going to fight this war, you have to split your military in half. You got to send half of them to Europe where they're going to fight against Germany and Italy, and the other half to Japan where they're going to fight against, or to the Pacific anyway, to fight against Japan. Now, that is, like I said, a pretty significant deal, and we're going to talk about what the plan is to deal with that here shortly. So I did want to throw this out here, guys. Take a look at this picture of Vice President Joe Biden, who is notably not necessarily the brightest person on the planet. And I'll give you a second to read his quote before I point out the fallacy in it. If you notice, evidently, Mr. Biden thinks that even after the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, we were great. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and move on from there now that you guys are probably chuckling. Germany then, as we talked about, invaded France. They had invaded Poland. They were fighting against Britain and the Soviet Union. And so consequently, that's kind of where Germany is. We also talked about Russia industrializing. And if you recall, we talked about Stalin taking power. And when he took power, he attempted to make Russia an industrial power. And to do so, he actually began to industrialize certain parts of Russia. And one of those parts was the southern part, in around where the Ukraine is today. And when he industrialized that spot, he caused a huge famine down there because basically what he had done, if you recall, was he had taken all the crops from all the farmers down there and they had taken it up to Moscow to be redistributed. Well, by doing so, he left a lot of people without food, causing this huge famine, and millions of people in southern Russia died. Now, if you remember, that was kind of one of the notable things about Stalin in that when we talked about him, we said he is attributed to killing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 million people, 12 to 16 million people. And that is largely due to that famine that he causes. So Stalin's not necessarily a great guy either. Okay, so but we'll ultimately become allies with Russia. Okay, so that's kind of where we left things off when we left. Let me come over here to this one, and let's talk about the war for North Africa and Italy, because this is kind of a big piece of the puzzle. Now, guys, I'm going to go through this fairly quick because for the length of the video here, time-wise, I don't want to have this enormous video that I have to put in here. So I'm going to go through this fairly quick, but I did go ahead and share this with you. Mr. John should have gone through the whole setup of your Google Classroom with you. So these notes will be on your Google Classroom. You'll be able to go in there and download a copy for you guys to have. Now, you could take these notes and do what you want with them. If you want to enter them into your notes by hand, that's fine. If you want to just look through them, just make sure you know this stuff. Don't file these away and never look at them again because it's not going to turn out well for you. All right, so let's talk about the war for North Africa and Italy. And to start us off with, now that we've been attacked by Pearl Harbor, and we discussed how America kind of geared up for that war, we took over the economy, we began to ration food, we began to really industrialize things. On the military front, we would enact the draft and draft people into the military. We had volunteers, and then we still needed more men. And so if you recall, we talked about how women began to join the military, and they were allowed to do so under the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, known as the WWII. So the U.S. and Britain are going to have to join forces now at this point. And so I put this quote in here, and you guys don't have to write this down later on at all. I just kind of think it's interesting. And but here's Winston Churchill 2 days after the Pearl Harbor attack. And you guys know me. I kind of like to imagine that the phone call went something like this. Churchill picked up the phone and called FDR. FDR said, "Oh, hello." And Churchill said, "Oh, hey, Frankie, it's me." And FDR said, "Oh, hey, Churchy, what's up?" And so then Churchill proceeded to say, "Now that we are, as you say, in the same boat, would it not be wise for us to have another conference? And the sooner the better." So they do. So they sit down, they have a conference. December 22nd, 1941, Churchill and FDR are going to spend 3 weeks together working on a battle plan. Now, interestingly enough, and this is sort of a side story that doesn't necessarily affect anything. For all intents and purposes, Churchill and Roosevelt became very good friends at this point. They'd spent 3 weeks working on this battle plan, and so consequently, it appears as though, historically speaking, these two guys become fast friends. In fact, they were regularly seen not just doing wartime stuff, but spending time outside of war, trying to spend time together. So anyway, they sit down, they're going to work on this battle plan for 3 weeks, and so they come up with an idea. Now, remember, we talked about how this was a split front war, where we would have to fight both Japan in the Pacific and Germany and Italy in Europe. And so they said, well, how are we going to do this? What's the best strategy for this? And the decision was made that they would strike first against Germany and Italy, then focus on Japan. Now, I do want to point out a couple of things. I tend to break World War II down into like topics. So we will be topical about how we address World War II. But a lot of times when this is discussed, when World War II is discussed, it's actually broken up by year. And there really isn't a right or wrong way to do this. But a lot of history teachers will talk about 1941, everything that's going on in 42, everything goes on in 43, 44, 45. And you get the idea. So, but I like to break it down by topic. So we will talk about what's going on in Russia, and then we'll talk about what's going on in North Africa, and then we'll talk about what's going on in Italy. And then we'll talk about what's going on in the Pacific. But be aware that some of these things were happening at the same time. So just because they were talking about fighting against Germany and Italy, they were also at the same time doing some fighting against Japan too. All right, so very first major battle area is the Atlantic Ocean. We talked about the battle, or we kind of mentioned it, but the Battle of the Atlantic is kind of the big part of trying to get stuff over to Britain and our troops over to Europe to fight. If you remember, we needed to provide stuff for them. Britain is really desperate for supplies. So if you recall, Hitler had come up with this brilliant submarine attack called the Wolfpack attack that worked very well. It was very effective against our ships, both transport ships and battle and destroyer ships. So by July of 1942, Wolfpacks had ended up sinking around 681 Allied ships. That's a pretty big number of ships. But at this point then, July of 42, we're going to start using some new technology to help counter submarines. So at this point, we have sonar, and we begin to use radar, provided, of course, by the British. And by using sonar and radar in conjunction, we could spot where the German planes were coming from to figure out where our ships were so we could shoot them down. And then sonar allowed us to spot where German submarines were coming under the water. Okay, and so we were able to begin to counter those Wolfpack attacks. And by spring of 1943, it's working, and Germans are losing more U-boats than they could even produce. It's even more than they were capable of producing. And America was producing more ships than we were capable of losing. Okay? I mean, that's kind of a weird way to put that, but we were producing more ships than we were losing. In fact, we were producing 143 Liberty ships per month. And if you remember when we talked about gearing up for this war, there was that Richmond, California shipyard that was producing these Liberty ships, and they could produce one of these ships, one of these massive ships, in as little as 4 days. And if you look for perspective, right here on the deck of the ship, there's a guy standing here just to kind of give you an idea of the size and scope of these ships. I mean, these ships are enormous, and they were producing one of these in 4 days. That is very impressive, to say the least. So anyway, we're able to very quickly succeed in the Atlantic against Germany because we are producing